At 11 minutes past midnight, my captain used a word I had never once heard a captain use in 19 years of flying, and she used it in the flat, unhurried voice a woman uses when she is asking for salt. "Nell," she said over the interphone, "come forward quietly, now." I put the handset back in its cradle and looked down the length of the cabin. 162 passengers, most of them asleep, the reading lights making little yellow islands in the dark. Halcyon Air Flight 217, the late service out of Osmarkville, 2 hours and 40 minutes across the water to Kingsreach. A full aircraft, a smooth climb, a routine night. 12 minutes earlier, I had handed a cup of tea to a woman in row 4 who told me she was afraid of flying, and I had said what I always say, which is that this is the safest thing you will do all week. I unlocked the forward galley curtain, checked the peephole, and let myself onto the flight deck. The smell hit me first, hot dust and something sharper, like a struck match. The overhead panel of a Corvin 500 has 91 switches on it, and I knew perhaps 20 of them by name. That night, 6 were lit amber and 2 were red, and Captain Verity Sloane had one hand on the control column and the other flat on the center pedestal, as if she were holding a table steady in a gale. The left seat was hers. The right seat held First Officer Piers Amond, and Piers Amond was the reason she had called me. He was slumped forward against his harness. His face had gone the color of wet paper. There was sweat standing on his forehead in beads I could see from the door, and his right hand was pressed to the middle of his chest, gripping the fabric of his shirt as though he meant to tear it, and his breathing was quick and shallow and wrong. "He said he had indigestion," Sloane said. She did not look away from her instruments. 4 minutes ago he said he had indigestion, then he stopped talking. "Piers?" I unbuckled him, got a hand under his jaw, tilted his head back. His skin was cold and wet. His eyes found me, and there was a terrible clarity in them, the look of a man who knows exactly what is happening to him and cannot say the word. All right, I have you." "Doctor," Sloane said. "Find me a doctor and get him out of that seat." "Verity." "Nell." Now she looked at me 1/2 second and I saw what her voice had been hiding. "We took hail, 9 minutes ago. It came out of a cell we could not see and it went through us like gravel through a fan. The radome is gone, the weather radar with it. My windscreen has a crack across the outer pane. I have lost the left generator and I have lost 2 air data sources, which means I do not trust my airspeed, which means I cannot use the autopilot, which means I am hand-flying an aeroplane that is lying to me at 31,000 feet. And now I have no first officer." She turned back to the glass. "Get me a doctor," she said, "and then get me a pilot." I have thought a great deal since about the shape of that hour, and how much of it turned on small things, on where people happened to be sitting, on what they happened to have in their bags, on a man who had drawn the short straw in a duty roster, and was therefore asleep in seat 27C instead of standing his watch at the front of the cabin. But at 11 minutes past midnight, I was not thinking about shape. I was thinking about the weight of a grown man. Dr. Ossian Ward was in 9F, a cardiologist coming home from a conference, and he was on his feet before I finished the sentence. Between us, and with the enormous, silent help of a rigger from Ostmark in 11C who had shoulders like a doorframe, we got Piers Amond out of the right seat and down onto the floor of the forward galley, on his back, with the emergency oxygen bottle at his mouth and Dr. Ward's fingers at his throat. 29, Ward said. "Thready, aspirin, do you carry aspirin?" "In the kit." "Chew it, don't swallow. Piers, can you hear me? Squeeze." I remember that Piers squeezed. I remember Ward saying, "Good man," the way you say it to a boy who has cleared a fence, and I remember the enormous cold relief of it, and I remember thinking in the same breath that we were now 162 passengers and 1 pilot over black water in an aeroplane that could not tell that pilot how fast she was going. I picked up the cabin handset. My hand, I noticed, was perfectly steady. I have never been able to explain that. It is not courage. It is 19 years of drill, and drill is a thing that stands in your body long after the rest of you has begun to shake. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, and I kept my voice at the pitch you use to announce a delay. "We have a passenger requiring medical attention, and we are grateful for the assistance already offered. We have one further request. If there is anyone traveling with us tonight who holds or has ever held a pilot's license, would you please make yourself known to a member of cabin crew immediately? I repeat, any pilot on board, please identify yourself to cabin crew now." The cabin woke up the way a cabin does. Heads came off headrests. The murmur began, that low traveling hum of 100 people asking one another the same question. And then in the second row, a hand went up. He had been a nuisance since the gate. Devrin Marsh, seat 2A, a tall, glossy man in a jacket that had cost more than my month, traveling on a corporate fare and letting everyone within 3 rows know it. He had complained about the boarding. He had complained about the water being still and not sparkling, and then, when it was sparkling, about the ice. He had told me twice that he did a great deal of flying, in the tone of a man who believes that being carried somewhere is a qualification. And at boarding, when the 2 men in scarlet came down the jetway with the rest of us, he had looked up from his screen and said, loudly enough for the galley to hear it, "Careful, the palace has sent us its Christmas decorations." I should tell you about the 2 men in scarlet. They were King's household guard, the ceremonial regiment, the men who stand at the palace gates in the red tunics and the tall black bearskins while the world takes photographs of them and tries and fails to make them blink. There were 2 of them on Flight 217, because Her Royal Highness the Princess Adela was in seat 1D. That is not as strange as it sounds. The King's sister has flown scheduled service for 30 years. She does it deliberately. She books late, she boards last, she carries her own bag, and she has been known to tell an equerry that if the realm is not good enough to fly on, the realm has bigger problems than her comfort. She had been at a naval memorial in Ostmark that afternoon. She was coming home. And because the household guard had furnished the honor party at the memorial, 2 of its men were coming home with her, in uniform, because the regiment does not travel in anything else when it travels with a member of the royal house. One of them, Guardsman Bell, was awake and upright in 2D, 3 feet from the princess, with his back straight enough to draw a line against. The other one was asleep at the back of the aircraft. I had noticed him at boarding because you cannot not notice him. He was a big man, dark-haired, perhaps 40, and the scarlet tunic and the white gloves and the row of metal ribbons on his chest made him look, in the aisle of a narrow-body jet, like something that had walked out of a painting and got on the wrong bus. He had folded himself into 27C with the unresisting competence of a soldier who has slept in worse places, put his cap case under the seat in front, folded his arms, and gone under before the doors closed. He had not asked for a drink. He had not asked for anything. 40 minutes into the flight, I had put a blanket across him because he was in the draft from the vent, and he had not stirred, and I remember smiling about it. Marsh had watched me do it and said, "Don't wake the mannequin." So that was the aircraft, at 11 minutes past midnight. A captain alone in the dark with a lying airspeed indicator, a first officer on the galley floor, a cardiologist on his knees beside him, a princess in row 1 with her hands folded and her eyes very steady, a self-important man in 2A, 160 other souls, and 1 royal guardsman asleep under a blanket in the second-to-last row. Marsh's hand was still up. "You're a pilot, sir." "I fly," he said, and he was already unbuckling. "Absolutely." "Happy to help." "What do you fly?" "A light single, 4-seat. I've got, 40-odd hours. He said this while standing, while adjusting his cuffs, while looking past me at the flight deck door as though it were a stage he had been waiting all his life to walk onto. "I've done a lot of simulator work, on the big ones. I've landed one of these in the simulator, actually, at a corporate event. 40 hours, I said. 42. Multi-engine. He blinked. It's a single. Instrument rating. I've flown in cloud. Behind me, the flight deck door opened 4 inches on the chain, and Captain Sloane's voice came through it, and there was no warmth in it at all. Do you have a type rating on a Corvin? Marsh stared. A what? Sit down, sir, said Sloane. Thank you. Now close the door. And Marsh sat down, but not before he said, into the silence of a listening cabin, in a voice pitched to make himself feel taller. Well, if nobody else is going to volunteer, I'd say you're all being rather ungrateful. That is when the voice came from the back of the aeroplane. It was not loud. That is the thing I have tried to explain to people ever since, and I have never quite managed it. It was not a shout. It did not carry over the noise. It went underneath it, the way a hand goes under a plate. It was a low, level, unhurried voice, and it was directly behind my right shoulder, and I had not heard him come up the aisle at all. Ma'am. I turned. He had the blanket folded over his arm. He had put it over the back of an empty seat as he came, because a soldier does not leave things on the floor. His tunic was scarlet and immaculate. His gloves were white, and his eyes, which I had never seen because they had been closed the whole flight, were gray and awake and entirely, frighteningly calm. I'm sorry to wake you, I said stupidly. Please go back to your... Ma'am, he said again, and something in the way he said it stopped me dead. You asked for a pilot. Somewhere behind him, Devrin Marsh laughed. It was a short, disbelieving bark of a laugh, and it was the last sound he made for a very long time. You're a guardsman, I said. Yes, ma'am. You stand at a gate. Yes, ma'am. I do that now. He shifted the blanket to his other arm, and he looked past me at the closed flight deck door, and when he spoke again his voice had not changed at all, and every word of it went into me like a nail. Before that I was Squadron Leader Roan Calder, Royal Eldermore Air Corps, 4,100 hours. 2,000 of them on the Corvin C-4 Wayne, which is the military variant of this aircraft, and which has the same flight deck as this aircraft, switch for switch, because they built one and sold the other. I was an instructor on the type for 3 years. I have flown it single engine, I have flown it on standby instruments, and I have landed it at night on a wet runway with no autopilot more times than I can count. The cabin had gone very quiet. Row 1 had turned around. Princess Adela was looking at him with an expression I could not read. Your license, I said, is it current? No, ma'am. It lapsed 4 years ago. Legally, I am a passenger. He said it without a flicker, the way you report a fact you have made your peace with. So it is the captain's decision, and it should be. But she is alone up there, and she is hand-flying with unreliable airspeed, and she will be alone for the next 40 minutes of the worst work of her career. Please tell her that a man who knows that flight deck is standing outside her door. Then let her choose. I have replayed that moment perhaps 1,000 times. I did not ask him how he knew about the airspeed. I found out later. He had woken at the hail, of course he had woken at the hail. A man who has flown through hail wakes at hail the way a mother wakes at a cough, and he had been sitting in 27C in the dark for 9 minutes doing arithmetic. He had felt the aircraft's power change. He had heard the pitch of the airflow. He had watched the cabin lights flicker in the way they flicker when a generator drops off the bus, and he had counted the seconds until they steadied and known exactly which generator it was. He had known. He had sat there, folded and still, and let the crew do their work, and he had not moved a muscle until we asked. I opened the flight deck door. Captain, I said, there is a man out here. Verity Sloane has 22 years and 11,000 hours, and she is the least sentimental human being I have ever worked with. She did not turn round. She said, over her shoulder, in the voice of a woman doing 3 things at once. Name and hours. Calder Roan, 4,100, 2,000 on the C4. Which seat did you fly? Both, left seat from my third year. Last time you touched a control column. A pause, 1 second, no more. 4 years and 2 months ago, ma'am. What's the flap speed for a 15 setting at our weight? On this aeroplane at about 62 tons, you want 190 knots. But your airspeed is unreliable, so you don't want speeds, ma'am. You want pitch and power. And the numbers for pitch and power are in the amber tabbed section of the book by your left knee. And if the book is unreadable in this light, I can give them to you from memory, and you can check them against the book afterwards. For the first time since I had come through that door, Captain Sloane took her eyes off the instruments. She looked at him for perhaps a second and a half. A man in a scarlet ceremonial tunic and white gloves and a row of ribbons, filling up the doorway of her flight deck at 31,000 feet, offering to read her the pitch and power tables from memory. "Sit down, squadron leader," she said. "Harness on, headset on. You are not a pilot on this aeroplane. You are a pair of hands and a voice, and I am the commander. And if I say a thing, you do that thing, and we discuss it in Kingsreach over a drink I am going to need. Do you understand me?" "Perfectly, ma'am." "Then get in the seat." He stripped the white gloves off with his teeth, one and then the other, and pushed them into his tunic pocket, and I saw his bare hands for the first time. They were not a statue's hands. They were scarred across the knuckles, and the back of the right one was marked with an old burn, a pale seam of it running up under his cuff. And when he reached for the harness, the movement was so fast and so exactly economical that I understood, in one cold rush, that everything I had assumed about the man in 27C was wrong. He did not look at the panel and hunt. He looked at the panel and read asterisk it, the way you read a page. "Left generators off the bus," he said, buckling. "You're on the right and the APU. APU won't start. I've tried twice. Then we're on one generator, and the battery is our friend, and I would like to stop being rude to it. Permission to shed load." "Shed it." His hands went up into the overhead panel and moved along it, not fast exactly. Unhesitating asterisk, which is a different thing and a rarer one. And one by one, the little amber lights went out, and the flight deck grew a shade dimmer, and the wine that had been climbing under the floor for 9 minutes stopped climbing. "Galley power's gone," he said. "Sorry, ma'am," and it took me a second to understand he was apologizing to me. Then he put the headset on over his short dark hair and pressed the transmit switch with his thumb, and the last of the guardsmen went out of him like a light going off. "Kingsreach Control, Halcyon 217. Mayday, mayday, mayday. 217 is a Corvin 500, 62 tons, 164 souls, 3 hours fuel correction, 2 hours 40. We have hail damage, no weather radar, unreliable airspeed on 2 sources, 1 generator, no autopilot, and 1 flight crew member incapacitated with a suspected cardiac event. We are declaring. Request direct routing, descent when able, and a long straight in to any runway you can give us with a precision approach. Standing by." I do not think I breathed during that transmission. "Halcyon 217, Kingsreach, Mayday acknowledged," said a voice, and the voice was young, and it was doing a very good job of not sounding young. "Break. Stand by, 217. Sloane said without turning her head, "Nell, go and tell my cabin exactly enough." I closed the door behind me. Exactly enough asterisk is a phrase they teach you in the 4th week of training and never explain, and you spend a career learning it. I stood in the forward galley with Piers Almond breathing at my feet and Dr. Ward's hand on his wrist, and I looked out at 162 faces turned towards me in the dark, and I told them exactly enough. I told them we had taken hail damage and lost some of our systems. I told them we had a doctor with our first officer and that he was conscious and stable. I told them that our captain had been joined on the flight deck by a former Air Corps squadron leader who had flown this exact type of aircraft for 2,000 hours, and I told them that we would be landing somewhat earlier than scheduled, and that they would be told everything before it happened. I did not tell them about the word Mayday. I have been asked since whether I felt I lied to them. I did not. There is a difference between the truth and every last piece of it, and the difference is what 162 people can carry while sitting still in the dark. There was a moment when it might have gone wrong. Halfway through, a woman in row 19 began to cry, not loudly, and the sound of it moved through the cabin the way one cough moves through a theater. I felt it start to turn. Fear in an aeroplane is not a feeling, it is a weather system. It has a front edge and it moves at a speed you can measure. And then Princess Adela stood up. She was 68 years old that year, in a gray traveling coat, with her reading glasses pushed up into her hair. She did not make a speech. She simply turned around in row 1 so the cabin could see her face, and she said, in a voice as ordinary as a woman asking about a train, "I have flown with the household guard for a great many years. If one of them has gone forward, then the matter is in competent hands, and I intend to finish my book. Would somebody be kind enough to turn my reading light back on?" The galley power was off. Her reading light was off. Everything non-essential was off, and she knew it, and she had said it anyway, and there was a ripple of something through the cabin that was almost not quite, but almost laughter. The woman in row 19 stopped crying. Guardsman Bell in 2D had not moved a millimeter through any of it. He sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes forward, and I thought, there are two of them, and they are both doing their job, and one of the jobs looks like nothing at all. Devrin Marsh, in 2A, was staring at the back of the flight deck door as though it had personally insulted him. "He's a asterisk doorman asterisk," he said to nobody. "He stands at a gate in a fur hat." Nobody answered him, not then, not for 2 hours. Here is what I have since learned about the 20 minutes that followed, because I was not in the room for them, and because Verity Sloane is a meticulous woman who wrote it all down. At 00:26, they had descent clearance and no way to use it, because you do not descend an aeroplane with unreliable airspeed by pulling the power off and pointing the nose down. You do it by numbers. Calder read them the numbers. Pitch 3 degrees, power 62%, and you check your descent rate against the clock and the altimeter, and you trust nothing else. And every 90 seconds you cross-check the standby instruments against the main displays, and note which one has begun to lie to you since the last time you looked. At 00:31, the crack in the captain's windscreen grew. It did not break. The outer pane of a Corvin windscreen is one of 3, and it is designed to be sacrificed. But it made a sound, a single sharp talk, like a stone hitting a shed roof, and Sloane wrote afterwards that she felt her heart go up into her throat and stay there. Calder, she wrote, did not react at all. He said, "That's the outer ply. It's meant to do that. We have 2 more and they're the structural ones. Look at your instruments, ma'am, not at your window." At 00:33, he asked her permission to leave his seat, went back into the galley, knelt on the floor beside Dr. Ward, and asked him one question. "Doctor, if we are on the ground in 40 minutes instead of 25, what does that cost him?" And listened to the answer and said, "Thank you," and went back to his seat and told the captain that they had 40 minutes and not more. That is the sort of thing nobody tells you about competence. We imagine it as speed. It is not speed. It is a man who knows exactly which question to ask and asks it once. And at 00:38, Kingsreach closed. The word they use is fog asterisk, but that is not what it is, not really. What comes off the estuary at Kingsreach in the small hours of an autumn morning is not weather so much as a decision the sky makes. It had been forecast at 400 feet, and it went to 111 minutes, and it took the runway lights, and it took the approach lights, and Kingsreach International, the only airfield in the realm with 2 long runways, a full crash and rescue category, and 3 hospitals within 20 minutes of the apron. Went, in the space of 1 radio call, from a certainty to a wall. Halcyon 217, Kingsreach. Kingsreach is now below minima. Reported RVR 100 meters and falling. We have no autoland capability for you with your systems degraded. Advise intentions. I know what that transmission sounded like on the flight deck, because it came through the interphone into the galley too. I was on my knees holding an oxygen bottle when I heard it. Dr. Ward's hand tightened on Piers's wrist, and Piers, who was gray and slow and terribly, painfully awake, said the first full sentence he had managed in half an hour. He said, "Callowfield's short." "Don't talk," said Ward. "It's short," said Piers Almond, and shut his eyes. He was right. On the flight deck, Verity Sloane was already looking at it. Callowfield, a regional field 90 miles south, 1 runway, 1,800 meters of it, which is a comfortable amount of runway for an aeroplane with functioning brakes and full flaps, and a reliable indication of how fast it is traveling, and a frightening amount of runway for an aeroplane with none of those things, and a crosswind that had been strengthening all night out of the west. "What else?" she said. "Ostmark's behind us, and it's got the same weather we flew out of," Calder said. 90 minutes back into a headwind on the fuel we have is not a plan, it's a hope. Highmore is closed for resurfacing until the 14th. "Then it's Callowfield." "No, ma'am." She looked at him. It was, she told me afterwards, the only time in the entire flight that he made her wait for anything. He sat with his hands loose on his knees, not on the controls, because they were not his controls, and he looked out at the black nothing where a horizon should have been, and she watched a man reach for a door he had bolted shut 4 years ago. "There is a military field," he said, "at Vantage. Vantage is Air Corps. Vantage is 3,000 meters of runway with a 2-degree slope in our favor, an arrestor system at the far end, a Category 1 crash and rescue crew who train for exactly this, and a precision approach radar with a controller on the other end of it who will talk us down all the way to the runway with their own eyes on our position. Which is what we need, ma'am, because our own instruments are a democracy and 2 of them are liars. It is 11 minutes from our present position. It is under the fog line. And it is the only place within our fuel where I would put this aeroplane tonight." Sloane said, "Will they open for us?" And squadron leader Roan Calder, who had not flown in 4 years, who stood at a gate in a fur hat, who had been asleep under a blanket in 27C 90 minutes earlier, while a man in a good jacket called him a Christmas decoration, said the sentence that I have never been able to get out of my head. "They will open for anyone who declares," he said. "Whether they will open for me is a different question. I want to stop the aeroplane here, if you will let me, and tell you about the storm on the Vesk Ridge, because without it none of the rest makes sense, and because I did not learn it that night. I learned it 8 days later, from a woman in a flight sergeant's uniform who cried while she told me and was furious with herself for crying. 6 years before Flight 217, a survey team of 9 went into the Vesk High Country in the last week of autumn to inspect a dam, and the weather turned on them the way it turns up there, not gradually, but like a door slamming. They got into a stone refuge hut at 4,000 feet with a broken radio and a broken leg between them and no way down. The Air Corps sent a helicopter. The helicopter got within 6 miles and turned back, because the wind was doing things that helicopters cannot survive. That left one option, and it was a bad one, a fixed-wing drop. A C-4 Wayne, low and slow through a valley with no visible sides, dropping a survival bundle and a 2-man mountain team by parachute onto a shelf of ground the size of a cricket pitch, at night, in the kind of turbulence that breaks aircraft. The officer commanding the station was a man named Ivo Grendon. He was then an Air Commodore, and he is a careful man, and I want to be fair to him, because I have met him and he is not a monster. He is a man who has spent his life doing sums with other people's lives in them, and has learned to be frightened of the answer. He looked at the wind, and he looked at the terrain, and he did the sum, and he decided that the survey team's chances were poor and the aircrew's chances were worse, and at 9:20 at night, he ordered the mission scrubbed. Squadron leader Roan Calder was already at the end of the runway, with his engines running. He acknowledged the order. Everyone agrees on that. The tape has him saying, "Vantage, Wayne 3-1, acknowledged." And then the tape has 40 seconds of nothing, and then it has the sound of 2 engines going to full power, and Roan Calder took a 50-ton transport aircraft off the runway at Vantage against the direct order of his station commander, and flew it up the Vesk Valley in the dark. He was in the air for 2 hours and 10 minutes. He made 4 passes. On the third, he put the mountain team out of the door at 300 feet above the shelf, which is a height at which a parachute is barely an idea. On the fourth, he dropped the bundle, tents, heat, a radio, a splint, food, and the tape from the mountain team's radio recorded one of them saying, 20 minutes later, that they had reached the hut, and that everybody in it was alive. 9 people came off the Vesk Ridge 2 days later. All 9. The youngest of them was a graduate surveyor of 22 who has since named a son Roan, which I did not know until I sat at a table with him at a certain ceremony and asked him why. And here is the part I did not believe when I first heard it. The Air Corps gave Roan Calder the silver wing for that night. They pinned it on him. It is a real thing. I have seen it, on the left breast of a scarlet tunic, second in a row of 5, and for 4 years I had walked past that ribbon at palace gates and on parade grounds and never once wondered what it was for. And then, 11 weeks after they pinned it on him, a board of inquiry sitting at Vantage under the presidency of Air Commodore Ivo Grendon found that Squadron Leader R. Calder had knowingly disobeyed a lawful order, had hazarded an aircraft and a crew of 4, and was unfit for further command in the air. They did not court-martial him. That is the thing people find hardest to understand. A court-martial would have been a hearing, and a hearing would have been public, and a public hearing would have had to explain to the realm why the man who saved 9 lives on the Vesk Ridge was in the dock. So instead they did the other thing, the quiet thing, the thing institutions do when they want a problem to stop being a problem. They endorsed his record, they lifted his command. They offered him a desk at a training establishment 300 miles from any runway, and they let it be known, in the way such things are let be known, that Squadron Leader Calder had a temperament that made him a poor bet. He handed in his commission on a Friday. On the Monday he walked into a recruiting office and enlisted, at 34 years of age, in the King's Household Guard, which is the one regiment in the realm whose entire art is standing still. I asked the flight sergeant why. Why that asterisk? Why, of everything a man like that could have done, would he choose to spend the rest of his life at a gate, in a hat, being photographed and mocked and told to smile by tourists? She said, because they told him he couldn't be trusted to hold still. She wiped her face and she said, so he showed them, every day, for 4 years. He stood there and he held still and he never said one word about the Vesk, not to anyone, not once. At 00:41, Halcyon 217 turned west. Vantage approach, Halcyon 217, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Nothing. Static and the hiss of a night frequency that nobody has used for 6 hours. Vantage approach, Halcyon 217 declaring an emergency. 60 miles east, Angels 14 descending. Corvin 500, 164 souls, hail damage, unreliable airspeed, single generator, no autopilot, incapacitated crew member. Kingsreach is below minima. Request precision approach radar to your runway 27. How do you read? Static. They're a military field at 1 in the morning, Sloan said. Are they even manned? They're manned. There's always a duty controller, and there's always a met man, and there's always someone in the tower who wants a cup of tea. Vantage approach, Halcyon 217 Mayday. And then a voice, and the voice was a woman's, and it was rough with sleep and hardening even as it spoke, the way a voice does when the words coming into a headset rearrange the whole shape of a night. Halcyon 217 Vantage approach, Red U5, Mayday acknowledged, say again souls and fuel. 164 souls, fuel 1 hour 10. Vantage, be advised we have a first officer with a suspected cardiac event. We need an ambulance on the runway, not on the apron. Copy, 217 stand by. Then a pause, 10 seconds, 12. On the flight deck they could hear faintly under the carrier the sound of a hand covering a microphone and a voice on the other side of that hand saying something urgent. Then Halcyon 217 Vantage. Be advised Vantage is a military aerodrome and is closed to civil traffic. Duty commander advises Callowfield is open. Weather is above minima, distance 90 miles. Recommend divert Callowfield. Verity Sloane's jaw went tight. Vantage, she said, Halcyon 217 is a mayday. I am not requesting. I am declaring. Under the emergency provisions of the Air Navigation Order, I am landing at Vantage and you will please have the runway lights on, the barrier down and the fire crews out. Acknowledge. 217 Vantage. The controller's voice cracked just slightly on the second word. Stand by. And in the silence that followed, with 60 miles to run and 1 hour 10 minutes of fuel and 164 people breathing behind him in the dark, Roan Calder pressed his transmit switch and did the hardest thing he did all night. Harder than the landing. I am quite sure of it. He said, Vantage, this is Halcyon 217. Is that Lark? Odie, is that you? A long pause. Say your name, said the controller. Roan Calder. You could hear her breathing. You could hear, in her breathing, an entire station coming awake 300 feet below her, because I promise you that whatever she did with her free hand in that moment, she did it hard, and somewhere in a low brick building a klaxon began to sound. Vantage approach, she said, and her voice had gone absolutely steel flat. Has you radar contact 59 miles east. Vantage is open. Runway 27, surface wind 250 at 18 gusting 28, we are wet. We will be lit in 90 seconds, crash and rescue rolling, ambulance to the runway. Descend flight level 100. Turn left heading 275. Vantage will provide talkdom. Sloane let out a breath she had, I suspect, been holding since Kingsreach closed. Thank you, Vantage. Halcyon 217 Vantage. A beat. Squadron leader, the duty commander, is standing behind me. He says the field is yours. Calder did not answer that. He looked at the fuel gauge, and then he looked out at the black, and Verity Sloane, who has told this part of the story 3 times now, in 3 official rooms, always in the same words, said that he sat there for 2 seconds and then he reached up and switched the cabin sign on and said, Ma'am, we should brief. They briefed, and then the aeroplane broke again. I was in the cabin. I had gone through it row by row with the 2 other cabin crew, Wren and young Pieter, who was 3 months out of training and did his job that night like a man of 40, and we had done the things you do. The bracing positions, the exit rows, the ABP briefing, taking the shoes off, getting the sharp things out of pockets. I had gone to row 1, and Princess Adela had listened to the brace instruction with the courteous attention of a woman being told how to fold a napkin, and had then said quietly, Miss Ashwood, is he all right, the guardsman? He's flying the aeroplane, ma'am. Yes, she said, but is he all right? I did not have an answer, and before I could invent one, every light in the cabin died. It was not darkness for long, 4 seconds, maybe 5, but the human animal does not measure that sort of time in seconds. The emergency lighting came up along the floor in its cold green line. Somebody screamed, one short scream, quickly bitten off. In the sudden hush, I could hear the air rushing past the fuselage, and it sounded, for the first time all night, like something that wanted to get in. The interphone chimed. I snatched it. Nell, Sloane's voice, and now at last there was a thread of strain in it. We've lost the second generator. We are on batteries and the standby system. You have no galley, no cabin lighting, no interphone in 90 seconds when I shed it, and I want you and your crew strapped in and braced from 20 miles out and not 1 second later. Is Piers secured? He's strapped on the galley floor with the doctor. Verity, what does that mean, the batteries? It means we have 30 minutes of electricity and we are going to use 20 of them. A pause. Behind her voice I could hear another voice, low, steady, running a list. Nell, listen. We have no autopilot, no weather radar, unreliable airspeed, no flap system beyond a limited setting, and the hydraulics that drop the landing gear are on the bus we just lost, so we will be lowering the wheels by gravity and we will not be able to raise them again. Which means when we start down, we are landing. There is no second attempt after we drop that gear. Do you understand what I am telling you? I understood. How long? 22 minutes. Verity, I stopped. What do you say? Is he good? There was the smallest sound down the line. It might have been a laugh. Nell, said Captain Verity Sloane, he just talked me out of a mistake that would have killed us, in a voice you'd use to order fish. Go and strap in. The line went dead. And then, because a cabin does not stay orderly simply because you have asked it to, it began to come apart. It started with a man in row 22 who decided, in the way frightened people sometimes do, that the safest thing he could possibly do was to stand up and get his bag out of the overhead bin. He was halfway there when Wren caught him. Then the man behind him stood up too, because that is how it works, and then a woman in 24 began to breathe in the fast, shallow, sipping way that means a person is about to lose the ability to hear anything you say. And Peter, 3 months out of training, 22 years old, with his hands full of a bag of ice and a first aid kit, he did not need, froze in the aisle and looked at me across 40 feet of green-lit darkness with the pure, naked panic of a boy who has just understood that there is nobody more senior than the people already in the room. I was strapping the last of the loose galley carts. I did not get there in time. Guardsman Bell got there. He had not moved from 2D for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He had sat 3 feet from the princess with his back straight and his eyes forward, while an aeroplane fell apart around him, and I do not think a single person on board had registered him as a living man rather than a fixture. And now he came up out of his seat and down that aisle in the green dark, 6'2" of scarlet and brass, and he did not run, because running is the fastest way to make 160 people run with you. He stopped beside the man from row 22. Sir, he said, sit down, please. That was all, 2 words and the asterisk, please asterisk. The man sat down, so did the man behind him. Then Bell went 4 rows further back and went down on his knees in the aisle beside the woman who could not breathe, and he took his white glove off, and he put his bare hand flat on the armrest next to hers, not touching her, near her, and he said something I could not hear. She shook her head. He said it again, and then he began to count, out loud, slowly, in a voice pitched so low that I only caught it because I had come up behind him. In for 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, hold out for 6, 1, 2. He did it 11 times, I counted. And by the 9th she was counting with him, and by the 11th she had let go of the seat back in front of her, and Bell put his glove back on and stood up and said, "Well done, madam," and went back up the aisle to row 2 and sat down and put his hands on his knees and his eyes forward, and did not move again. I found out afterwards where he learned that. He learned it standing on a box at a palace gate in August, in a wool tunic and a fur cap, at 31 degrees, in the 4th hour of a 5-hour watch, when the black spots start crowding in at the edges of a man's vision, and he has precisely 1 tool left to keep himself upright and conscious in front of 800 cameras, and the tool is his own breathing, and the number is 4, and the number is 6. They are not decorative, those men. Every single thing about them that looks like ornament turns out, if you follow it far enough back, to be a solution to a problem you have never had to have. That is the story of Flight 217 in one sentence, if you want it in one. I went back up the aisle in the green half-dark, and I did the thing I have done at the end of every safety demonstration for 19 years, which is to walk the length of the cabin and look every passenger in the face. It takes a minute. It is the most important minute of the job, and it is not in any manual. Row 19, the woman who had cried. She had a stranger's hand in hers now, and she was holding it with both of her own. Row 11, the rigger from Ostmark, who had carried a dying man out of a cockpit and who now sat with his enormous hands folded, looking at me steadily, waiting to be told what to lift next. Row 2, Guardsman Bell, upright, eyes forward, one hand resting on the seat back in front of the princess, as though he could hold the aeroplane together by holding on to that. Row 2A, Devon Marsh, who was not glossy anymore. He had gone the color of the fog we had run from, and he was staring at the seat pocket in front of him, and as I passed he grabbed my sleeve and said, is he actually a asterisk pilot? I took his hand off my sleeve and put it back on his armrest. He's a Royal Guard, I said. It turns out that's a thing a man can be as well. And then I sat down in my jump seat facing 162 people in the dark, and I put my hands under my thighs the way we are trained to, and I listened to the engines, and I waited to find out how the rest of my life was going to go. Everything I am about to tell you about the last 20 minutes comes from 3 sources. The cockpit voice recorder, which was read into the record of the inquiry. Captain Sloane's account, which she gave to me over 2 bottles of wine and did not finish either time. And Flight Sergeant Odie Lark, who was sitting in a darkened radar room at Vantage Air Station with a headset on and a grease pencil in her hand, watching a small green mark crawl towards her across a screen. Odie Lark had trained on precision approach radar for 11 years. She had talked down more than 400 aircraft. She had never talked down a civil airliner because civil airliners do not need talking down. They have equipment for that, and the equipment is better than she is. Except when it isn't. Halcyon 217, Vantage talked on. This will be a precision approach to runway 27. Do not acknowledge further transmissions. Do not acknowledge further transmissions. It is the loneliest sentence in aviation. It means, from this moment, I will speak and you will not answer, because I need your hands on the airplane and not on the radio, and I will keep speaking every 5 seconds so that as long as you can hear my voice, you know I can see you. And if I stop speaking for more than 5 seconds, you will climb away immediately, and you will not wait to be told. 217, you are 12 miles from touchdown. Turn right heading 272. Begin your descent now to maintain a 3-degree glide path. Wheels should be down. Ma'am, said Calder on the flight deck, gear. And this is where it went wrong. The landing gear of a Corvin 500 comes down on hydraulic pressure. When there is no hydraulic pressure, because the pumps that make it are electric, and the electricity has gone, you open a hatch in the floor between the seats, you take hold of a red and white handle, and you pull, and the great steel legs of the aircraft fall out of their bays under their own weight and are supposed to swing forward into the airstream and lock. Calder went down on one knee on the flight deck floor, in a scarlet ceremonial tunic, and pulled the handle. There was a shudder through the airframe, a deep, satisfying mechanical asterisk clunk-clunk as the 2 main legs went out and down and locked, and a green light came on for the left, and a green light came on for the right. The nose gear light stayed red. For 3 seconds, nobody said anything. Nose gear unsafe, Sloane said, in a voice from which every trace of humanity had been surgically removed. 2 green, 1 red. Recycle it, said Calder, already reaching, and they did, and it did not change. He came up off the floor and into his seat, and his hands went across the panel in that unhurried, reading way, and he said, It's not the light. The light's on the same bus as the taxi lamps, and the taxi lamps are dead. So the light could be lying too, but I'm not going to bet 164 people on a light bulb. Assume the leg is hanging and hasn't locked. 10 miles, said Odie Lark's voice. On glide path, on Central Line, heading is good. What happens if it isn't locked? Said Sloan. It folds on touchdown. We go onto the nose, and we spend the next 30 seconds sliding down 3,000 meters of concrete on our chin at 140 knots with a fuel load. Which we survive, he added. Probably. But probably is not a word I'm prepared to use tonight. Then what? Then we swing it forward. I have listened to the tape of this. There is a silence of about a second and a half, and then Verity Sloan, commander of Halcyon 217, says, in a voice that is almost amused. With what asterisk, squadron leader? With the aeroplane, ma'am. Here is what he knew, and what she did not, and what no civil pilot in the realm had any reason to know. The C-4 Wayne, the military variant, the one that lands on rough strips and gravel and half-built runways in places where nobody has ever heard of a maintenance schedule, has the same nose gear as the Corvin 500. Identical. And the men who flew the Wayne, who lowered that gear by gravity twice a month in training, and for real more often than anyone in the Air Corps liked to admit, all knew the same dirty little trick, which is written in no manual anywhere, and which is passed from instructor to student like a family recipe. If the nose leg hangs, if it falls out of its bay but does not have enough airflow behind it to swing forward and snap into its down lock, you give it some. You yaw the aeroplane, hard. You stamp on the rudder and you skid the whole airframe sideways through the air, so that the wind comes at the nose leg from an angle instead of straight on, and it takes the leg like a hand on a door and pushes it forward, and it locks. It is violent. It is uncomfortable. It costs you height and speed, and it is a thing you do not do below 1,000 feet. They were at 2,300, 9 miles out, in cloud on batteries, with an unreliable airspeed indicator, and 1 hour and 4 minutes of a night that had already taken everything they had. Do it, said Sloan. Ma'am, it's your aeroplane, say the words. Do it, squadron leader. Rudder asterisk now. The tape does not record what it felt like. I can tell you what it felt like, because I was strapped into a jump seat in the dark at the back of a cabin full of people who had been told to brace. It felt like the world went sideways. The whole aeroplane slewed. Not a turn, a asterisk slide asterisk, a great nauseating skid, the fuselage crabbing through the air with the wind slamming into the left side of it, and everything not tied down went across the cabin, and the woman in 19 screamed, and somebody's bag came out of an overhead bin that hadn't been latched and hit the ceiling and burst, and I will hear it until I die. I heard the airframe groan asterisk, a long structural complaint from somewhere deep in the wing root. The sound of a thing being asked for more than it was built to give. 2 seconds, 3. And then under the floor, forward of where I sat, a single enormous asterisk thud, like a giant setting down a suitcase. And the aeroplane came level. 3 green asterisk, said Verity Sloan. 3 green, Calder confirmed. Nose gear down and locked. Ma'am, I have to tell you that I have never done that in a passenger aircraft, and I would like it noted that I did not enjoy it. And Verity Sloan laughed. On the tape at 8 miles from touchdown on batteries in cloud, she laughs one short, cracked, disbelieving syllable, and then she says, noted. And then the flight deck goes quiet and stays quiet, and that is where the last part begins. 217, 7 miles. You are slightly right of Central Line, turn left 268, on glide path. Wind 250 at 20, gusting 32. 32 knots, gusting, across a wet runway at right angles to it near enough. I did not know the number at the time, and it is just as well. 217, 6 miles, coming back to Central Line nicely, on glide path, Gently, gently. Vantage weather, cloud base 400 feet, visibility 2,000 meters in rain. 400 feet. That is how much sky they would have between coming out of the cloud and touching the ground. 400 feet is about 7 seconds. 7 seconds at the end of it all, to look at a runway and decide. 5 miles on glide path, on centerline. On the flight deck, Verity Sloane took a breath and let it out and said, "You have control." The tape has a pause here. It is 1 second long. It is my favorite second of the whole recording, and I have listened to it more times than is healthy. "Ma'am," Squadron Leader called her. She was speaking quickly now because there was no time, and because she had clearly decided this some minutes before and had been waiting for the last possible moment at which changing her mind would still be honest. "I have 11,000 hours. I have never hand-flown this type below minima without an autopilot, on standby instruments, with unreliable airspeed in a 30-knot crosswind at night onto a wet military runway. Not once. Not in the simulator, not for real. You have. Onto asterisk this runway. How many times?" "I don't know, ma'am." "Approximately 100. Perhaps more." "Then you are the most qualified pilot in this aircraft to fly the next 4 miles, said Captain Verity Sloane. "And I am the commander, and that is why I get to decide who flies it. I will handle the power, the radio, and the checklist. You will handle the aeroplane. You have control." Another pause, half a second. Then a voice, and Odie Lark told me that she heard it in her headset and had to put her hand flat on the desk in front of her, because for the first time in 11 years, she nearly lost the thread of a talk-down. "I have control," said Roan Calder. "I want to be careful here, because this is the part everybody wants me to make into something it wasn't. They want the last 4 minutes to be heroic. They want a man wrestling a machine, straining, jaw set, muscles corded, the picture that gets painted afterwards on the front of magazines. That is not what happened. I have watched the flight data traces with an investigator's finger tracing them for me on a screen, and what happened over those last 4 minutes was the single most undramatic piece of flying that man ever did in his life, and that is exactly the point. The control inputs are tiny. You can see them on the trace, little corrections, dozens of them, each one no bigger than a nudge, and none of them late. The aeroplane goes down the glide path like something being lowered on a wire. The gusts come in, you can see them. Sharp vertical spikes in the wind trace, 32 knots, 34. A horrible one at 800 feet that shoves the whole aircraft 12 feet off the path. And the trace shows the correction beginning a fraction of a second asterisk before the deviation is fully developed, which is a thing that instructors talk about and almost nobody can actually do, because it does not come from the hands. It comes from having sat in that seat, in that weather so many times that your body has stopped asking your brain for permission. 4 years standing at a gate had not taken it out of him. I think, in fact, that 4 years standing at a gate had sharpened it. Because what is a household guardsman if he is any good at all? He is a man who has learned to sit inside a storm of noise and heat and provocation and tourists, and camera flashes and idiots making faces 2 feet from his eyes, and to feel all of it, and to be moved by none of it, and to keep his attention exactly and only on the one thing he is there to do. There is a name for that in his old profession, and the name is airmanship asterisk. 217 2 miles on glide path, on centerline, wind 250 at 28. Sloane calling, 600 feet. 217 1.5 miles, slightly high adjust rate of descent, on centerline. 500. 1 mile on glide path, on centerline, you're looking lovely 217. That is on the tape. You're looking lovely, 217. Odie Lark says she does not remember saying it and would prefer it were struck from the record, and the board declined to strike it, and I am glad. 400 feet. and then the cloud let go of us. I have one window in my working life, and it is a small oval one beside my jump seat at the back of the cabin, and I am not supposed to be looking out of it during a brace. I looked out of it. The world came up out of the gray all at once. Rain, silver and horizontal, ripping past. And below and ahead, tilted at a strange angle because we were flying crabbed into the wind with our nose, pointed a full 10 degrees off the runway we were about to land on. Two great converging lines of white lights, going away and away into the dark. Farther than any runway I have ever landed on in my life. Farther than seemed reasonable. 3,000 meters of soaking wet military concrete with a red bar of lights across the far end of it, and standing along both sides at intervals. Blue and red flashing lights, the crash crews out in the rain waiting. And in the middle of the lights, on the wet black surface, a long white sentry line coming up at us at 140 knots. "Runway in sight," said Sloan. "Continuing," said Calder. 300, 200, 100. 50. He flew it into the wind all the way down. The whole aeroplane came at that runway sideways, nose cocked left into a crosswind that was trying to shove a 62-ton aircraft off the concrete and into the grass, and he held it there sideways until the very last instant. And then, at some height that the flight data recorder puts at 11 feet, and which Verity Sloan describes as not enough, he did two things at the same time with his 2 feet and his 2 hands, and he did them so exactly together that the trace looks like one movement. He kicked the rudder to swing the nose straight down the runway, and he dropped the upwind wing into the wind to stop the aircraft drifting. The left wheels touched first. Just them, one side of the aeroplane, kissing the wet concrete and then rolling, and only after a beat did the right side come down and take its share, and the nose leg that had been hanging in the airstream unlocked 9 minutes earlier, settled onto the runway with a bump you could have slept through. We were down. And we were doing 130 knots on a wet runway with no thrust reversers on one side, no spoilers and brakes that had exactly as much pressure as was left in a steel accumulator the size of a fire extinguisher. "Braking," said Calder. He got, by the design of the system, 6 applications, 6 squeezes of the pedals, and after that there is nothing, and the aeroplane rolls until it stops or until it hits something. He used 4. I could feel them. Not the panic stamp of a man trying to stop a runaway. 4 long, deliberate, patient presses, each one held, each one released before the wheels could lock and skid on the water, and between them the enormous roar of the wet runway under us and the rain hammering the fuselage, and the lights going by slower and slower and slower. The red bar at the end of the runway, the arrestor barrier, the great net they put up for fighter aircraft that cannot stop, came out of the dark and stopped coming and sat there, and did not get any bigger. We came to rest 410 meters short of it, in the rain, on the central line, with the engines running and the emergency lights glowing green along the floor. Nobody moved, nobody made a sound. And then, over the cabin address, because he had put his headset back on the hook and reached across, unasked, for the handset, and because he was the only person on that flight deck capable of speech at that particular moment, a low, level, unhurried voice came into 162 pairs of ears. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the flight deck. We are on the ground at Vantage. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while the medical team comes aboard for our first officer. Cabin crew, you may release your straps." A pause. "That is all. That is all." And 162 people came apart at once. I have been in cabins where people applauded a landing. Every crew member in the world has, and we all pull the same tired face about it. This was not that. This was a sound I had never heard before, and hope never to hear again. A great, ragged, uneven roar that was made of shouting and crying and laughing and prayer all at the same time, and it went on and on. And Peter, 3 months out of training, was standing in the aisle with his hands over his face, and the rigger from Ostmark was hugging a stranger, and the woman from row 19 was on her feet holding on to the seat back in front of her, and I sat in my jump seat and did not move and could not, because my legs had stopped belonging to me. The forward door opened, and the rain and the cold came in, and with it 4 paramedics and a fire officer, and they went straight through the galley and knelt down beside Piers Almond, and one of them said, "Hello, sir, we're going to take good care of you." And Dr. Ossian Ward stood up off his knees for the first time in 51 minutes and sat down heavily on a jump seat and stared at the floor. Piers Almond was in a hospital in the town of Vantage 40 minutes later, and in a cardiac theater 20 minutes after that. He is alive. He is at his desk in the airline safety department 3 days a week, and he has taken up gardening, and his wife sends me a card every year on the 11th of October, and I have never once opened it without crying. Roan Calder did not leave the flight deck for 11 minutes. He and Captain Sloane sat there in the dark with the engines shut down and the checklists complete, and neither of them said anything at all, and finally she reached over and put her hand on his forearm, on the scarlet sleeve, and left it there. Then he took his white gloves out of his tunic pocket and put them on. I want you to understand what that means. There was no reason to put those gloves on. He had just flown an aeroplane. His hands were shaking. Sloane says they were shaking so badly by then that it took him 3 attempts to get the second one on, which is a thing that happens to men when it is over and not before. There was no inspection, no parade, no photographer, and it was 1:15 in the morning at a wet military airfield. He put the gloves on because a household guardsman does not walk through a public place with his hands bare. Then he opened the flight deck door and came out into the cabin, in the green emergency light, with 162 people looking at him. And the aeroplane stood up. Not all at once. It started somewhere around row 14, one man getting to his feet, and then it went both ways up and down that cabin like a fire in dry grass, and they were standing on their seats and in the aisle and they were shouting, and I have never in my life seen anything like it, and I never will again. He stopped. He stood there in the aisle with his cap under his arm and his gloves on, and he looked genuinely, completely at a loss for the first time all night. This man who had yawed a passenger jet sideways at 2,000 feet without blinking, and then he did the only thing his training had left him. He came to attention, and he bowed his head once to the cabin. Then he walked up the aisle to row 1 and stopped and said, "Ma'am." Princess Adela was on her feet. She had put her book away. "Guardsman," she said, "your name?" "Calder, ma'am." "Sergeant Household Guard, 3rd Company." "That," said the princess, "is not the whole of your name." And he stood there for a long moment, in the aisle of a broken aeroplane on a runway 300 miles from where he was supposed to be. And then he said it, out loud, in front of 162 witnesses, for the first time in 4 years. "Squadron Leader Roan Calder, ma'am, Royal Eldormore Air Corps, retired." "Not retired," said Princess Adela. "Discarded. I know the difference. I have been on the boards that do it." She looked at him with those steady, unimpressed, entirely royal eyes, and she said, "I read the VESC file 11 weeks after it was closed. I have thought about it perhaps once a year since. I did not know your face." "No, ma'am." "You have stood at my brother's gate for 4 years." "Yes, ma'am." "And you did not think," said the princess, "that it was worth mentioning." And Roan Calder said, and Guardsman Bell, standing 2 feet away with tears running openly down his face and his chin up and his eyes forward, and his back straight enough to draw a line against, heard him say it, and told me later that it was the proudest and the saddest sentence he had ever heard a soldier speak. "It wasn't my post to talk, ma'am. It was my post to stand." Devrin Marsh was waiting at the bottom of the air stairs in the rain. I do not know how long he had been there. He had refused the coaches. He was standing on the wet concrete in his ruined, expensive shoes with his jacket over his arm and the rain flattening his hair to his skull. And when Calder came down the steps, he stepped forward into his path and stopped, and opened his mouth, and nothing came out of it. He tried 3 times. I was 6 feet away and I watched him do it. "I called you he said. "Yes, sir." "I said you were "I know what you said, sir." Marsh stood there with the rain running off his chin, a tall, glossy man with nothing glossy left on him, and he said, in a voice I would not have believed came out of that mouth, "My daughter is 11. She's asleep in Kingsreach. She has a photograph of one of you on her wall, one of you in the hat at the gate, and I have been telling her for 2 years that it's a silly picture, that you're just—" He stopped. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and it did no good at all. "I don't know what to say to you." "Then don't say it to me, sir," said Roan Calder. And he put his cap on, and he walked past him into the rain, towards the tower, where a woman in a flight sergeant's uniform was standing at the bottom of the steps with her hand already coming up to the salute, and where, behind her, at the top, an old man in an air marshal's greatcoat was standing very still and watching him come. I was not close enough to hear what passed between Roan Calder and Air Marshal Ivo Grendon at the foot of the tower steps at Vantage Air Station at 25 minutes to 2 in the morning. Nobody was. They stood there in the rain for less than a minute, and Calder saluted, and Grendon returned it, and Grendon said something, and Calder answered him with about 4 words, and then they parted. Odie Lark, who was 2 steps away and who has been asked about it more times than she can bear, will only say this, that the air marshal's voice was not steady, and that the guardsman's was. What I do know is what Grendon did next, because it is in the public record. He went back up into his tower. He sat down at the duty officer's desk at 2 o'clock in the morning, with his coat still dripping, and he wrote out longhand a statement of 11 pages and signed it and had it witnessed by the duty controller. And at 6 a.m. he sent it, over his own name and his own seal, to the Judge Advocate of the Air Corps, to the Air Board, and to the private secretary of His Majesty King Alaric. I have read it, everyone has read it, they printed it in full. It says that on a night 6 years ago he made a judgment about wind and terrain and risk, and that his judgment was defensible, and that he still believes it was defensible. It says that, when a subordinate officer disobeyed that judgment and brought 9 people off a mountain alive, he, Grendon, experienced not relief but humiliation, and that he did not know it at the time, and that he convened a board of inquiry which he told himself was about discipline, and which he now understood at the age of 63, standing in the rain watching that same officer walk away from an aeroplane he had just put down on his runway, to have been about his own pride. It says, I did not break the rules to end that man's flying career. I used them. I have spent 30 years telling young officers that the second is the worst crime, and I have never once believed it applied to me. And it asks, in its final paragraph, that the finding of the board of the Vesk Ridge inquiry be quashed in its entirety, and that Squadron Leader Roan Calder's fitness for command in the air be restored to the rolls, and that if the board requires a resignation in the matter, it may have his. The Air Board quashed the finding 4 weeks later. They declined the resignation, and Air Marshal Ivo Grendon served out his final 18 months and retired without ceremony at his own request, and I am told he now keeps bees. I have thought about him a good deal. I do not think the world is improved by making him a villain. He did a wrong thing, and then, when it cost him everything to say so, he said so out loud in his own handwriting with his name at the bottom. There are a great many men who would have watched that landing from a tower and said nothing at all. The palace announced the investiture for the 12th of November. There were 4 of us on the list, which I did not expect and still cannot entirely account for. Captain Verity Sloan, Dr. Ossian Ward, Flight Sergeant Odessa Lark, and me, the Queen's Commendation for Conduct, which I keep in a drawer and take out perhaps twice a year and look at and put back. and Sergeant Roan Calder of the King's Household Guard, 3rd Company, who came into that long gilded room in his own scarlet tunic, with the medals he had been wearing all along on his chest, and who was the only man there whose uniform did not need to be borrowed or bought. King Alaric is not a tall man, and he does not raise his voice. He read the citation himself, which they tell me is unusual, and he read it slowly, and when he came to the part about the yaw maneuver at 2,300 feet he stopped and looked up and said, off the paper, to the room, "I am told this is not in the manual." There was a sound in that room that was not quite laughter. "No, sir," said Calder. "Should it be?" "No, sir," said Calder. "It should be in the memory of men who have flown the aeroplane. That's a different place. Things live longer there." The king pinned the bar to the silver wing on his tunic, the second award, the one the board had made impossible 6 years earlier, and then he did not step back, which is what he is supposed to do, and there is a photograph of this moment that ran on the front of every paper in the realm. An old king with his hand still on a guardsman's shoulder, and the guardsman's eyes fixed rigidly, correctly, hopelessly forward. "Squadron leader," said King Alaric, "the Air Board has restored your commission. My sister tells me the Air Corps would have you back tomorrow, in a flying post, at your rank and seniority, and that there is a training establishment advantage which would give a great deal to have a man who can teach that maneuver to people who will one day need it." "Yes, sir, they have made me the offer." And here Roan Calder, decorated combat pilot, 4,100 hours, the man who brought Halcyon 217 down onto 3,000 meters of wet concrete in a 30-knot crosswind with a dead nose gear light and 4 squeezes of a brake accumulator, said the thing that made a princess put her hand over her mouth and a captain of the line sob openly in the 3rd row. "Sir," he said, "with respect and with gratitude I should like to do both if the regiment will have me. I will fly for the Corps and teach for them, and I will do it gladly, but I should like to keep my post." "Your post," said the king. "At the gate, sir, 3 days a month if it can be arranged. I have stood there for 4 years." He paused, and for the first and only time in front of that room his voice went somewhere it had not been. "I took that post because I had been told I could not be trusted to stand still, and I found, sir, that I was very good at it, and that it is not nothing. There is a man in this room who told his daughter that the picture on her wall was a silly picture. It is not a silly picture. I should like to go on standing in it." King Alaric looked at him for a long moment. "Then stand in it," he said. "That is nearly all." The airline gave the aeroplane's nose gear leg to Vantage Air Station, where it is bolted to a plinth outside the officer's mess with a brass plate that says nothing except a date and a flight number, because Roan Calder asked them not to put his name on it, and because Odie Lark told them, in words I am not permitted to reproduce, exactly what she thought of any plate that put one name on that night. Devrin Marsh wrote a letter. He sent it to the airline, and the airline sent it on, and it was 4 pages long, and the last paragraph is the only one anyone has ever quoted, and I will not quote it here because he did not write it to be quoted. He funds 2 scholarships now at a flying school on the East Coast for the children of servicemen. There is no plaque on those either. I checked. Piers Almond flew again, not as a pilot. The medical board would never allow it, and he made his peace with that faster than any of us thought he could. He flies as a passenger. He sends me pictures from airports. And Captain Verity Sloane, who was the commander of that aeroplane from the first second to the last, and who gave away the control column at 5 miles because she was good enough to know she should. Captain Sloane is a training captain now, and she teaches a module she wrote herself, and she made them call it command is not the same as flying asterisk, and she opens it every single time with the same sentence. The hardest thing you will ever do is decide that the best pair of hands on your aeroplane is not attached to your arms. I saw him once more, in the way that anybody can see him. It was the following spring, and I was in Kingsreach with a 5-hour connection and nothing to do with it, and I walked up to the palace with the tourists. He was on the left-hand box. Scarlet tunic, tall black bearskin, white gloves, the rifle, the row of ribbons, and second in that row, if you knew what you were looking at, a small silver wing with a bar across it. There was a family in front of me. The girl, 11 or 12, in a yellow coat, had her phone up, and she was doing what they all do, leaning in, pulling a face, trying to make him look at her. He did not look at her. He did not blink. The rain came down and ran off the fur of the bearskin and off the peak of his cap and down his immaculate scarlet back, and he stood there in front of that gilded railing exactly as he had stood there for 4 years and would stand there for many more. A man doing nothing, at attention in the wet, while the world took photographs of him and laughed and moved on. And I stood in the crowd with my hands in my pockets, and I thought about a red-end white handle in the floor of a flight deck. I thought about 4 brake applications out of 6. I thought about a voice saying that is all to 162 people who had just been handed back their entire lives, and then hanging up the handset, and then putting its gloves on because that is what one does. The girl in the yellow coat gave up on him. She turned to her father. "He's not even real," she said. "He's just standing there." And her father, a tall man, who had come to the front of the crowd and stopped and gone quite still, and who did not answer her for a long moment, said, "Yes, he is." He took her hand. "That's exactly what he's doing," said Devon Marsh. "Come on. I'll tell you about him on the way home." They walked away down the wet cobbles, and I stayed a little longer, and the guard at the gate did not move, and did not speak, and did not break. But I have flown for 19 years, and I know a thing now that I did not know before, and I will tell you what it is. Stillness is not emptiness. It is the lid on a great deal. And when they need it, when the lights fail and the instruments lie, and a captain opens a door into a dark cabin and asks for a pilot immediately, and there is nobody, the men who have spent their whole lives learning not to move will be the first ones on their feet.